Hey, AP Biology class, here is chapter 53, at least Mr. Johnstone's summary of all the slides here for chapter 53. This is population ecology, and I would say that the most informative thing, or the most popular thing that ecologists are seeking out are population sizes. Of course, they're studying the community structure and the individual organism level ecology as well, but population ecology is really where you can really do the most application. If you know how many species, how many individuals of a species are in a given area, which is what a population is, then you can make some really informed decisions about how to use that land, how to treat that species, how to help that species recover if it's declining, things like that. So from an application point of view, population ecology is really where it's at, and I would say most ecologists are doing their research at least at this level when they're trying to answer questions about ecology. So right here on the first slide, this is a great example of a nice study that was done with kestrels, which are these small raptors, and the experiment was to actually introduce more eggs to the nest and see what the survivorship of the male and female parents were into the next year, and then take eggs away from the nest and let them rear a smaller number of small kestrel babies, and then see what the survivorship of the parents was into the next year. Not surprisingly, when you enlarge the brood size, the survivorship of the mother and father bird actually go down into the next year. They're spending so much energy caring for those eggs and caring for those new young birds that it's actually to the detriment of the mother and father bird. And then, of course, normal brood sizes see normal survivorship. And then when you take eggs or young birds away from the nest and give the male and female parents fewer eggs and young birds to care for, then the parental survivorship is actually increased into the next year, because again, they're just left raising a few eggs or a few individuals, and that makes sense. But a great, simple population ecology study where from one generation to the next, the numbers of individuals in that population are changing, specifically the numbers of surviving parents into the next generation. Those are fun little birds. I like kestrels. So here's our main ideas. Populations can be described mathematically in different ways. So we can describe them as density, or how many are dispersed in certain ways. We can say that there's more over here than over there. We can say that overall there's an average sort of density or an average number in a given habitat or in a given area. We can describe them as declining or increasing. We can describe their birth rates and death rates. And so there's a bunch of mathematical pieces that we can use to describe populations. And of course, population dynamics is all about reproduction. So there are organisms, species, individuals within a species that are being born in any given generation, and there are some that are dying in any given generation. And if there are more that are being born than dying, well, then that population is probably growing. And if there's more that are dying than are being born every generation, well, then that population is probably shrinking. And again, an ecologist is going to want to know that. So this is all about reproduction. So you'll see in the next few slides, it's all about aspects of how species and individuals reproduce. And then our last main point here is that populations have carrying capacities dictated by various factors of their ecosystem. So populations can only grow so much. They can grow exponentially for a time, but at some point, something's going to limit how many individuals of a species can be in a given area. The question is, what is that limiting factor, or limiting factors if there's more than one? And there's different kinds of limiting factors, and we'll talk about those as well. So I talked about births and deaths, and that's really what it boils down to. In this case, birds being born and birds dying, and that results in a population that's either shrinking or growing. But we can also deal with migration. So birds immigrating to a population, or in this case, these birds emigrating from this population, that's sort of the same as births and deaths. It's organisms that are being brought into this population and individuals that are being taken away from the population. So the effect of birth and death rates is similar to the effect of immigration rates and emigration rates as well. It's up to the ecologist and the biologist to decipher really how is this population declining or growing. Is it really because of birth and death rates, or is it because of migration rates, or maybe it's because of both? And when we talk about, I talked about the kestrels there, the survivorship into the next generation, how many eggs and young birds are surviving into the next generation, and how many of the pre-existing parental generation are surviving into the next generation as well. How long-lived are those birds, and how long-lived is any species as it reproduces over the years? And we end up with these kind of three scenarios here, what we call survivorship curves. The top one, which is the red line there, which is like large creatures, large mammals specifically, for example, humans, lie along the survivorship curve number 1, which is that the percentage of the maximum lifespan is on the x-axis, and the number of survivors is on the y-axis. So as time goes on, when humans, for example, or large mammals are born, we have a pretty high survivorship. We survive for many years, and we age and we grow for a long time. And then as we get older, we actually get less good at surviving because we're old, and so individuals start to die, and so our survivorship goes down later on in our lifespan. And then conversely, the opposite is things like a lot of invertebrates, for example, oysters and clams and things like that, have what's called a type 3 survivorship curve, which is the opposite, where you can see early on in the percentage of the lifespan, there's going to be this precipitous drop-off in the number of individuals that are surviving from one generation to the next. But they do survive for a long time, but not many of them survive. So that's a different kind of survivorship curve, and that results in different kind of ecological and lifestyle characteristics of those organisms. Typically, the oysters, for example, or a lot of invertebrates will produce a lot of organisms or a lot of offspring in their reproductive events, knowing that not many of them are going to survive into the next generation. But if they produce a lot of them, for example, octopus produce like 5,000 offspring in one reproductive event, and now only 5 of them will survive into the next generation or to be adults. So that would be a type 3 survivorship curve. Now, in the middle is type 2, which are a lot of small animals, a lot of birds, a lot of small mammals, reptiles falling along this category. Here you can see the squirrel here falling along this category. This is just sort of the middle category. It's that the type 2 curve is that a decent number survive in the young years. A decent number of them keep surviving halfway through their lifespan, and then at the end of their lifespan, well, there just aren't a lot there, and that's the same for any of the survivorship curves. So type 1, type 2, and type 3 survivorship curves tell us about how these organisms are surviving from one generation to the next and over several generations, and that gives us a clue as to how they're going to reproduce. Type 1 survivors tend to produce a few offspring at a time, knowing that those offspring have a high survivorship rate. And type 3 type 3 survivorship curve organisms tend to produce many, many hundreds or thousands of offspring in every generation, knowing that not a lot of them will survive past the first few years of their life. And here's some more about life history of organisms. It matters the maturity of when reproduction begins. So how many years does it take for an organism to become mature enough to reproduce? That has repercussions for the growth or decline of a population. For example, how many in a population are actually of sexual maturity or of reproductive maturity matters a lot. The second thing here, how often the organism reproduces. So can an organism reproduce multiple times in a season, multiple times in a year? Or in the case of, for example, a lot of large organisms like whales or elephants, or even humans, we can really only reproduce, once a year, or maybe once every several years, depending on what kind of organism and species that you're talking about. So that has repercussions for how quickly a population can recover from a decline, or how quickly a population will grow just to begin with. And the last thing here, the third thing, is how many offspring are produced each time. So when you do reproduce, how many offspring are produced? Like I said, the octopus can produce over 5,000 just in one reproductive event, whereas in humans, for example, we produce just 1 or maybe 2 in our reproductive events. And that matters for over time for the growth or decline of that population. And of course, we know that populations can't grow forever. They can have exponential growth. You can see here, you know what mathematical exponential growth looks like, and populations will do this if they have unlimited resources, including unlimited space, unlimited food, unlimited reproductive opportunities, things like that. But we know something will cap them at some point. So, for example, in the graph here on the right-hand side, you can see that there's some sort of carrying capacity being reached by this red line, this S-shaped line. That's what we call the logistic curve. As the population approaches their carrying capacity, or whatever limit that they're approaching in their ecosystem, that reproduction and the growth is going to be slowed down, and eventually hopefully that population will reach that capacity and stay there. Now that doesn't always happen, but we do know that populations cannot keep growing exponentially given limited resources. And there's a little bit of calculus here, dNdt, that function. And there's a little bit of calculus used in this kind of study of population growth. We will not study that, and you don't need to understand the complete application of that calculus, but that would be the kind of mathematics that would be used to evaluate where a population is along their exponential or logistic growth curves. Here you can see an example of this. Paramecium, if you put them in a culture, they will grow exponentially for a given time period until they reach some limiting resource. The limiting resource is probably space, because they're probably growing in a beaker, or it's probably nutrients. Eventually, the Paramecium will start to compete for nutrients, and they won't be able to grow and reproduce quite as fast as they did before when resources were unlimited. And the other one here is the Daphnia population. The Daphnia, actually, the red line is the optimal growth here, but the dots, data points there, actually show you that the Daphnia, they kind of like overshot their carrying capacity by quite a lot, and they sort of declined a little bit, but came back into equilibrium with their optimal carrying capacity there over time. In the days, like past 100 days there, you can see the Daphnia settled into a nice equilibrium with whatever their natural optimal population size should be in that situation. And we often see this. We often see organisms overshooting their carrying capacity, particularly those type 3 survivorship organisms, those invertebrates mostly. Insects do this, crustaceans, other invertebrates, for example, tend to produce a lot of offspring and overshoot their carrying capacity, given the chance. But they will settle back into this sort of S-shaped curve that tells us that they're oscillating around their optimum carrying capacity, or some kind of optimum in their ecosystem given the limited resources. So over years, most organisms will grow exponentially at first, and then they will tend to overshoot their carrying capacity just by a little bit or a lot, depending on the organism, and then settle into a nice oscillating pattern. We see that with a lot of data gathered in a lot of studies. And now we have two types of factors that are coming into play here. We have density-independent factors. These are things that are affecting population sizes regardless of how big or how small those population sizes are, or how densely packed those populations are. These are things like natural disasters, or unusual weather, or seasonal cycles, or human activities. When we pollute an ecosystem, it's going to lead to the decline in populations of species in that ecosystem, regardless of how big those populations are, or regardless of how small those populations are. So those are density-independent factors. And of course, we have density-dependent factors. These are the interesting factors that operate only when the population density reaches a certain level. So, for example, predation or parasitism or disease operate at certain levels depending on what the density of that species population is. So predation occurs at higher rates when there are higher numbers of prey, for example. Parasitism occurs at higher rates when there are higher densities, when organisms are living in more close contact with each other. And disease can spread more rapidly in a densely populated population, and competition will rise also. Competition for resources is for sure density dependent, because the more densely packed population you have, the more competition you're going to have for those resources. So these are the more natural, more interesting, I think, factors that affect the growth of a population, density dependent factors. And here we have this question that says, what causes a population to fluctuate or to be stable? Well, it depends on what species you're looking at. In this case, we're looking at moose. That's the red line over time, over the years, their survivorship, the size of their population, and the size of the wolf population. What's interesting is, as you see the increase in moose in the years, or in the year or years after that, you see an increase in the wolves. The wolves are probably feeding on those larger on the larger number of moose, and then eventually the moose sort of reached their own carrying capacity and decline a little bit. And then again, in the year or years after that, the wolves follow behind that. We call that the shadow effect in population biology, where the predator won't increase right along with the prey. It takes a year or 2 or 3 for the predator to actually follow the same pattern. And so you see this increase in the prey first, and then you see the increase in the predator second, and then you see the decrease in the prey again after that, and then you see secondarily the decrease in the predator after that. So we call that the shadow effect, because the predator graph sort of has a shadow when shown in relation to the prey graph in this case. Here's another example of that, snowshoe hare population and the lynx population. You can see the lynx predator population growing in the year or years after the spikes in the snowshoe hare population, not right along with them.